May 8, 1945. As the smoke of a burning continent begins to clear, General Dwight D. Eisenhower looks east toward the ruins of Berlin, not with the triumph of a conqueror, but with the cold, calculated skepticism of a man who knows the next war has already begun. Why did the Supreme Commander halt his armies at the Elbe? Was it a strategic blunder of the highest order, or a masterclass in preserving the lives of his men against a ruthless ally who viewed human life as expendable? The transition from the Second World War to the Cold War was forged in the heat of a tactical and psychological clash between two of history's most formidable military minds. General Eisenhower, the master of Allied logistics, and Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Conqueror of Berlin, represented two diametrically opposed philosophies of command. While the public celebrated the crushing of the Nazi machine, the private diaries of Eisenhower's inner circle, specifically the records kept by his naval aide, Captain Harry C. Butcher, reveal a deep-seated distrust that permeated the highest echelons of the Allied command. This internal friction was not merely about how to end the war, but about what kind of world would emerge from the rubble. As the spring of 1945 unfolded, the Western Allies faced a monumental decision point that would define the geography of the modern world. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the 21st Army Group, was obsessed with a narrow thrust directly to the heart of the Reich. He dreamed of a triumphal entry into Berlin, a city he viewed as the ultimate prize of his long career. Montgomery demanded absolute priority on fuel and supplies, essentially asking Eisenhower to sideline every other army group to facilitate his personal glory. But Eisenhower, schooled in the military tradition of the broad front, was not moved by poetic notions of conquest. He viewed Berlin through a clinical lens, describing it in a private cable to General George Marshall as nothing more than a geographical location. Eisenhower's decision to bypass Berlin was rooted in the harsh reality of military logistics and a profound desire to avoid unnecessary American casualties. He had asked Lieutenant General Omar Bradley for an estimate of the cost to seize the Nazi capital. Bradley's answer was chilling: 100,000 casualties. For Eisenhower, the price was too high for a city that had already been designated as part of the Soviet occupation zone at the Yalta Conference. He knew that any ground his soldiers took in Berlin would eventually have to be surrendered to Joseph Stalin's Red Army. Eisenhower prioritized the destruction of the Wehrmacht's remaining forces and the elimination of the National Redoubt in the Bavarian Alps, a region he feared would become a haven for a protracted Nazi insurgency. This strategic caution drove General George S. Patton into a state of incandescent fury. Patton, commanding the Third Army, believed that the Allies were destroying the wrong enemy. He watched the Red Armies advance with a warrior's suspicion, convinced that the Western powers were paving the way for a Bolshevik domination of Europe. In his private journals, Patton railed against the weak-kneed congressmen and the unprincipled reporters who he felt were stifling the American offensive. He famously pleaded with Undersecretary of War Robert Patterson to keep the American boots polished and bayonets sharpened, arguing that force was the only language the Soviets understood. Patton wanted to push beyond the Elbe, past the agreed-upon lines, and if necessary, drive all the way to Moscow. The friction between Eisenhower and Patton reached a boiling point as the American spearheads reached the Elbe River. Eisenhower issued the order to halt, creating a physical separation between his forces and the advancing Russians. Patton viewed this as a betrayal of the liberated peoples of Eastern Europe. He saw the Red Army as a scurvy race of savages, and his blunt, often offensive rhetoric began to threaten the fragile diplomatic alliance Eisenhower was desperately trying to maintain. Eisenhower, ever the diplomat, had to manage the emotional range of Patton, who he noted lived at one extreme or the other. Each time Patton committed a diplomatic boner, he would return to Eisenhower close to tears, promising to do better, only to explode again days later. While the Western generals argued over maps and supply lines, Marshal Zhukov was leading a force of 750,000 men in a relentless, high-casualty pursuit of total victory. Stalin had set his marshals, Zhukov and Konev, in a brutal race to capture the Reichstag. This was the people's meat strategy, a term Zhukov himself ironically warned his subordinates against, yet one that characterized the Soviet offensive. The Red Army paid a staggering price for Berlin, suffering over 100,000 dead in the final assault. To Eisenhower, this was a strategic nightmare. He could not comprehend a command philosophy that would sacrifice so many lives for a political symbol that was already strategically dead. The psychological standoff between the two systems was nowhere more apparent than in the Schaff War Room at the Little Red Schoolhouse in Reims. The walls were plastered with hand-painted maps detailing the absolute collapse of the German lines. But they also served as a silent warning to any German emissaries. Eisenhower's hatchet man, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, used these maps as tools of psychological warfare during the surrender negotiations. He forced General Alfred Jodl to sit across from charts detailing the hopeless position of the German army, ensuring the Prussian general understood that he had no cards left to play. The atmosphere in that room was thick, with the scent of damp earth and the heavy haze of cigarettes, a sensory backdrop to the death of the Thousand-Year Reich. Eisenhower maintained a posture of cold moral disgust throughout the proceedings. He refused to meet with the German delegation until the unconditional surrender was signed. He did not offer Jodl a chair, a drink, or a handshake. This was a calculated move to establish the Nazis not as professional military peers, but as common criminals who had broken the laws of humanity. Eisenhower was washing the hands of the Allied armies, ensuring that the victory of the Great Crusade remained untainted by any sense of soldierly camaraderie with the architects of the Holocaust. His refusal to offer a handshake was the first moral architectural pillar of the post-war world. But the surrender at Reims was only the beginning of a deeper geopolitical mystery. Joseph Stalin was furious when he heard of the ceremony. He viewed the Reims signing as a preliminary protocol, a Western attempt to steal the glory of the Soviet sacrifice. Stalin demanded a second, grander ceremony in Berlin, the very lair of the fascist beast. This created the historical enigma of the war that ended twice. Eisenhower, recognizing the tangled skein of European politics, agreed to the second signing to preserve Allied unity, even though the operational war in the West was already over. While the High Command negotiated, the soldiers on the ground were dealing with the chaotic reality of the collapse. The 101st Airborne Division and the 3rd Infantry Division were racing toward Berchtesgaden, Hitler's Alpine retreat. They discovered the treasures of the regime, Hitler's silver, wine lockers, and stolen art, symbols of a dispossession that was as total as the military defeat. In the mountains of Austria, the last combat actions of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, were coming to a close. These elite fanatical units were fighting not for victory, but for the chance to surrender to the Americans, rather than face the Red Army's retribution. The German government, such as it was, had retreated to a tiny 15-square-kilometer enclave in Flensburg. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the successor to Hitler, presided over a phantom government that was functionally dead but legally persistent. Dönitz's strategy was one of calculated delay, using Operation Hannibal to evacuate millions of refugees from the East. He hoped to secure a separate peace with the West, a tactical delusion that Eisenhower crushed with a single ultimatum. If the Germans did not sign unconditionally on all fronts, Eisenhower threatened to seal the Western Front and leave the retreating Germans to face the Russians alone. This ultimatum forced Jodl's hand at 2:41 a.m. on May 7. The Prussian general, his face described as a death mask, signed the document that delivered his nation into the hands of the victors. Yet even as the ink was drying, the first fractures of the Cold War were appearing. The Soviet liaison, Major General Ivan Susloporov, had signed the document without explicit permission from Moscow. He had gambled his life to ensure the Soviet Union was not omitted from the final victory, an executive decision that would later cost him his career under the paranoid gaze of Stalin. In the days following the surrender, Eisenhower tried to build a personal bridge with Zhukov. He invited the marshal to his headquarters, hoping that a soldier-to-soldier relationship could mitigate the rising tensions. But Eisenhower soon discovered that Zhukov was a man without independent authority, a Kremlin mouthpiece who could not make a single move without Stalin's approval. The ideological differences were becoming irreconcilable. Eisenhower, an optimist by nature, began to realize that the security of the United States would rely not on a lasting partnership, but on an adequate military defense against a new expansionist power. Patton, meanwhile, was doing everything in his power to provoke a confrontation. During a luncheon in Linz, he reportedly engaged in a whiskey-drinking duel with a Soviet general. While the Russian ended the night out cold, Patton walked out under his own steam, declaring the Soviets to be scurvy savages whom the Americans could easily defeat. He viewed their supply lines, largely dependent on horse-drawn wagons and American-provided trucks, as a critical vulnerability. Patton believed the Allies could reach Moscow in 6 weeks if they struck then, before the Soviets could consolidate their grip on Eastern Europe. The world is at a crossroads. The Great Crusade has fulfilled its mission, but the moral architecture of the victory is already under siege. Eisenhower has won the Battle of Wills at Reims, yet he faces a future where his own generals and his Soviet allies are drifting toward a violent fracturing. The Little Red Schoolhouse has witnessed the end of one tragedy and the silent, uneasy birth of another. As the dawn of May 9, 1945 broke over the ruins of Berlin, the war that ended twice finally became official. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the chief of the German High Command, walked into the Soviet headquarters at Karlshorst with his marshal's baton in hand, an aging aristocrat attempting to salvage a shred of dignity from the wreckage of total defeat. Marshal Zhukov watched him with a bright and sinister gaze, a look that never left Keitel's face as the German general struggled to fix his monocle. The air was electric with a different kind of tension than in Reims. This was not just a legal procedure, but a ritual of absolute submission to the power that had bled the most for this victory. The documents signed in Berlin were almost identical to the Reims instrument, yet the symbolic weight was transformative. Stalin's insistence on this second ceremony was a message to the world. The Soviet Union was the primary architect of the Nazi defeat, and the Western Allies were merely witnesses to the final act in the lair of the fascist beast. Eisenhower, recognizing the tangled skein of European politics, had avoided the Berlin ceremony himself, sending his deputy, Air Chief Marshal Tedder, in his stead. This subtle distancing in the moment of triumph was the first quiet admission that the wartime coalition was a marriage of convenience that had outlived its purpose. The private diaries of the participants during this period reveal a haunting transition from camaraderie to calculation. Captain Harry Butcher noted that Eisenhower was already pensive, his thoughts turning toward the nagging details of occupation and the growing ideological divide. Eisenhower's Abilene Code, the idea of meeting an opponent face-to-face and taking the same risks, was being tested by a Soviet system that he found increasingly opaque. He respected Zhukov as a soldier, but feared the materialistic dialectic that drove the Soviet leadership. Eisenhower famously remarked that no people on earth can be held to be an enemy. Yet he was beginning to see that the ruling clique in Moscow viewed the world in terms of total domination or total defeat. The most stunning moment of this personal and strategic clash occurred during a frank discussion between Eisenhower and Zhukov regarding tactical doctrine. Eisenhower, obsessed with the logistical and human costs of every operation, asked the Marshal how the Red Army dealt with the lethal obstacle of German minefields. Zhukov's response left the Supreme Commander speechless. The Marshal explained that the Soviet infantry simply attacked through the minefields as if they were not there. He calculated the losses from personnel mines as being equal to what they would have suffered from machine guns or artillery had the Germans defended the area with troops instead. To Eisenhower, this was a revelation of a primitive, brute command philosophy where the lives of troops were as expendable as metal washers. This fundamental difference in the value of human life was the hidden engine of the Cold War. Eisenhower's logistical caution, which Patton viewed as cowardly and safety first, was actually a commitment to a solid foundation for operations to prevent fatal reverses. The Soviets, conversely, practiced a deep battle doctrine that prioritized speed and operational breakthrough over the preservation of individual units. This friction was not just academic. Units like the secret T-Force were already SCAT engines and rocket data, sometimes engaging in kidnapping to ensure that the intellectual assets of the Reich did not fall into Soviet hands. While the generals jockeyed for position, the disarmament of the Wehrmacht became a logistical Herculean task. Millions of German soldiers were surrendering their sidearms. Walter P-38S, Luger P-08S, and the revolutionary STG-44 assault rifles. Piles of these weapons, once the tools of a relentless blitzkrieg, were now being guarded by bored American GIs. Among the surrendered equipment were the heavy hitters of the German war machine. Tiger II tanks and 88mm flak guns, now mere scrap metal. This disarmament was not just about security, it was about the total demilitarization of a society that the Allies were determined to rebuild from the ground up. But General Patton had a different plan for these weapons and the men who carried them. As the military governor of Bavaria, Patton began to trivialize denazification, keeping former Nazi officials in their administrative posts because He believed they were the only ones capable of running the local infrastructure. Patton's inflammatory remarks about the wrong enemy and his suggestion that the Allies should rearm the Wehrmacht to fight the Soviets began to leak to the press. He famously stated that, "We have destroyed what could have been a good race of people, the Germans, and we are about to replace them with Mongolian savages." This was a diplomatic disaster that Eisenhower could no longer tolerate. Eisenhower's decision to relieve Patton of command in October 1945 was one of the most painful leadership dilemmas of his career. As he told his son John that evening, "I'm not moving George for what he's done, just for what he's going to do next." Eisenhower saw that the war was over, and Patton was a man whose emotional range and bloodthirstiness made him dangerous in a world that needed rebuilding, not more fighting. Patton was transferred to the 15th Army, a unit that was little more than a group of historians documenting the war. The old blood and guts general felt betrayed, convinced that Eisenhower had sacrificed him for political expediency and the presidential bug. The tragedy of Patton's final days was compounded by a mysterious car accident in Germany just months after his removal. His death marked the end of an era of natural warriors, but his warnings about the Soviet menace would soon be vindicated in the eyes of many. By 1946, as George F. Kennan sent his long telegram from Moscow, the policy of containment began to take shape, a policy that mirrored many of the fears Patton had expressed, though without his racial vitriol. The unshakable conviction that a threat to freedom persisted began to drain the wealth and labor of nations into a new arms race. The legacy of the Reims standoff is also found in the fate of the German signatories. General Alfred Jodl, who had expected to be treated as a gentleman by Eisenhower, instead found himself in the dock at Nuremberg. He was found guilty of conspiracy to commit crimes against peace and war crimes, including the authorizing of the shooting of hostages. The man who had sat at the utilitarian table in the Little Red Schoolhouse was hanged in 1946. His last words were, "I salute you, my eternal Germany." The refusal of the handshake at Reims had been the legal and moral precursor to the gallows. Admiral von Friedeberg, the initial emissary who had played for time during the negotiations, chose a silent exit. He committed suicide shortly after the arrest of the Flensburg government on May 23rd. He realized that the separate peace he had sought was an impossibility, and that the Kriegsmarine's actions would hold him accountable under the new moral architecture of the victors. His death was the final, quiet collapse of the Donitz administration, which had lived in an idyllic atmosphere for 2 weeks after the surrender, supplied with food and fuel by the British before the political reality finally caught up with them. Major General Ivan Susloporov, the Russian who signed first, also faced a darkened future. Recalled to Moscow after the Reims ceremony, his career effectively ended, as Stalin sought to minimize any Soviet participation that wasn't personally directed by the Kremlin. Susloporov's decision had prevented a diplomatic fracturing in the moment, but in the paranoid world of the Soviet high command, he was an errand boy who had exceeded his authority. He died in 1974, a marginal figure in a history that he had arguably saved from immediate disaster. As we deconstruct this crucial decision point, we must ask, was Eisenhower right to leave Berlin to the Soviets? The decision saved 100,000 American lives and avoided a potential friendly fire catastrophe between the two advancing armies. Yet it also ensured that Berlin would remain behind the curtain for 45 years, a strategic nightmare that would justify the threat of general nuclear war during the subsequent crises. Eisenhower's broad front had won the war, but it had also defined the boundaries of the longest peace in history, the cold peace of mutual suspicion. In his farewell address years later, President Eisenhower would warn against the military-industrial complex, a danger he saw born in those final months of 1945. He had seen how the engines of righteous destruction could become permanent fixtures of a society in perpetual fear. He had developed a personal friendship with Zhukov during the occupation, even sending the Marshal high-quality American fishing rods when he fell out of favor with Khrushchev. Eisenhower's ability to draw the hearts of men had worked with his soldiers and even his enemies, but it could not overcome the irreconcilable ideological differences of the two systems. The Little Red Schoolhouse in Reims remains today exactly as it was on May 7, 1945. The maps are still on the walls, the simple wooden chairs are in place, and the air still seems to hold the palpable gravity of that historic night. It is a shrine to history that encapsulates the professionalism and stark reality of the military operation that brought about the end of the European War. It reminds us that monumental history often hinges on unglamorous, functional moments. A classroom converted into a command center. A signature etched in ink on a modest document. The story of the Eisenhower-Jodl standoff and the skepticism of the private diaries is a reminder that victory without moral clarity is no victory at all. Eisenhower's refusal to shake hands with a Nazi general was his most important tactical move, establishing a boundary that the world has tried to maintain ever since. As we look back at the forgotten parade of 1945 and the whiskey duels of Linz, we see the flawed, brilliant, and exhausted men who inherited a broken world and had the steely resolve to build something better from the ruins. In your view, was Eisenhower's decision to halt at the Elbe River a brilliant move to save American lives? Or was General Patton right that the Western Allies should have taken Berlin and pushed all the way to Moscow? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.